Welcome to episode 3 of Rock of Aging here at The Dark Stuff. Erika and I are here to bring you, I don't know if it's your fix of hair metal information and conversation, but like it should be, frankly, at this point. Because this is your third
fix. It's right. My fix of
it's your third
about 80s metal for sure.
Because it's your third episode here, so you guys know what you're getting at this point. Like now we're in the groove going on right here. So let's start off with this episode. We have our topic, but as we always do, we're gonna start off with a little bit of metal news, that information that you guys might need. Maybe you don't. I don't know, but we're gonna present it to you because we think you do need it. Frankly, my news is that Gene Simmons of KISS has announced a bunch more dates for his Gene Simmons Band to play in 2025. Now, as we all know, KISS retired at the end of 2023. Thankfully, okay, they're my favorite band, but they had to stop. Okay, they were just too old and they couldn't cut it anymore. However, Gene Simmons has his new band, and he's got some pretty impressive guys with him in this band. He's got Brent Woods, who apparently plays with Sebastian Bach and Vince Neil, Zach Throne, who plays with Corey Taylor, and a guy named Brian Tishy, who plays with the Lynch Mob, Whitesnake, Billy Idol, Foreigner, and Slash. So that's his backup band. And he's going out on tour beginning on April 5th. That's the first show in Rohnert Park, California. And as of now, winds up May 24th at the House of Blues in Houston. Now, of course, I mean, I'm borderline interested in the Gene Simmons Band, but I'm also not that interested in the Gene Simmons
Band. Yeah, I was going to ask you, will you go see this?
I mean, I don't know. And the reason why I say I don't know is just because I'm just tired of people who are so old and they just don't know when to leave the stage. Like, I love Gene Simmons, okay? He's my favorite. KISS is my favorite band. I have a tattoo of Gene Simmons on my ankle, okay?
Wow.
And I'm saying all of that, and I'm still saying, please, just retire. I mean, look, if it was in Omaha, I'd go, but I wouldn't road trip at all. I mean, that would be just kind of like a non-starter. Whereas for me, if it was KISS, like I used to be like, oh shit, I'm in no matter what. Now I'm like, I don't know.
I think that's so interesting because I was talking to a bunch of other venue friends of mine about this tour, and all of us were asking ourselves that question. Does anyone care about this? Will anyone actually buy tickets to see Gene Simmons by himself? And so it's very interesting for you as a lifelong hardcore KISS fan to say, I'm probably not going to that. Like, I think that's a good indicator for how these shows might potentially go.
So our main topic for this month's show is sort of underappreciated 80s metal bands that seemed like everything was in place for them to do really well. They made great music. They, whatever, all the stars were aligned for them, yet it somehow didn't happen. And for whatever reason, they're just on this ash heap of like never really made it or almost made it or whatever, bands that are largely forgotten except by the diehards.
Start with a band that really, for me anyway, I only knew one song from this band, and I only bought it as a cassette single. I didn't even invest in like the full cassette. I only went cassette single for them. However, this song is a jam, and the band that I'm referring to is a band called Electric Boys. They had a song called All Lips and Hips. This is a band that's actually Swedish, and they formed in 1987. And they're still performing now. They're actually out in February and March on a Scandinavian tour. But this song sounds like it could be part of a 2025 Spotify playlist. Like, it's a very cool rock song, a lot of 60s and 70s influences. And so it's got that psychedelic kind of quality to it. The video for All Lips and Hips is basically filmed inside a circus tent, or like, did you ever play with those parachutes in PE in elementary school where like you went like this with the parachute and then everybody jumped inside? Like, that's what the video looks like. It's a super cool video though, and I love this lead singer. His name is Connie Bloom. He's still the lead singer of this band, and like I said, they're still making music. Like a lot of these bands, they kind of went through various iterations in terms of lineup. They all four, the original members all reunited, like maybe back in 2009, but have since kind of splintered off again. But the band still exists, and the band's still out creating music and touring. I feel like I need to go back and actually listen to the entire album. I believe the name of the album was Funk O Metal Carpet Ride. And
right
so
on
it
that
did
one,
have
yeah.
that funky, yeah, it had that funky element. It was super cool. But I love All Lips and Hips. If you guys don't know that song, you need to go listen to it. It's a jam.
You know what? When you sent me that name, I was like, how do I know them? Like I couldn't even remember them. I missed those guys. I didn't really catch them.
Yeah.
But I did listen to the video, or watch the video, and I watched maybe one other video that they had. So yeah, that was a thing right about 88, 89, where there was a lot of that funk metal stuff was starting to come out, funkier stuff. A lot to do with the Red Hot Chili Peppers getting popular and their influence, and Faith No More a little bit too, and that influence on metal. Every bass player was starting to do the little slap funk metal thing or whatever on their bass. And
this song I do think is super cool. And this song is funk, but it's a little bit more 60s psychedelic. And so I think that's what kind of makes it a little bit unique.
My first one is a band that you didn't know about, so maybe I'm thinking a lot of other people don't know about, and that is the Rock City Angels.
Yeah.
Now, the Rock City Angels have been kind of lost to time. I mean, in fact, their only major label album, one album called Young Man's Blues that came out in 1988, is not even on the streamers. It's completely out of print. It's gone. The only thing that you can find is an abridged version of the album that is said to be the alternate mix of somebody, so there's only like about 10 tracks, and it was a double album. So there's only part of it available, not the original version. So Rock City Angels formed in 1981 in Florida. They were originally called the Abusers. They changed their name to the Delta Rebels, and then ultimately became the Rock City Angels. They moved from Florida to LA. They had a recording contract. They started getting a buzz in LA, to the point where they got signed to Geffen Records in 1986 for $6.2 million, which is one of the biggest record contracts for an unknown band that had come out at that time. Johnny Depp, by the way, was a one-time guitarist for the band when they came to LA. He's not on any of the recordings. He's not in any real photos or anything, but for about a year, when he was an up-and-comer, he was playing with this band. So they signed to Geffen in 1986 for $6.2 million. But guess who else signed to Geffen in 1986 from LA? A raw, kind of rough band, a band named Guns N' Roses. And
the GNR influence absolutely overshadowed everybody else. And so I listened to this band to, a couple of the stuff, the things I could find on YouTube. And it was interesting, but it was very much of the time. Like it did feel like so many of these bands became these carbon copies of one another, and the labels were just pushing out the same thing over and over and over again. Now they kind of had a little bit of a blues aspect, I thought.
Right. Now these guys,
but they were cool. I'm surprised I didn't know more about them, because I didn't know anything about this band.
Well, what's weird is, so they are convinced that their career was sabotaged by Geffen Records in favor of Guns N' Roses. Now, I don't see the point in that, but what happened was when they signed to Geffen removed them from Los Angeles, moved the band to Memphis, Tennessee, and they spent the next year and a half writing and recording their album. Meanwhile, Guns N' Roses was playing all over LA. They were playing all over, the West Coast and whatever. They were building up their reputation, and these guys were sitting in Memphis working on music. So by the time the album came out in 1988, Guns N' Roses was huge. And I just don't believe that Geffen tried to sabotage them, because, first of all, they wouldn't have offered them that much money in the first place. Second of all, Geffen allowed them to put out a double album as their debut. That's the first time any artist with Geffen Records has ever released a debut double album. So I feel like they did think this was going to be a big record. They immediately went out on tour with Jimmy Page as the opening act, but then they kind of were relegated to sort of clubs at that point. They didn't really get any other big tours after that. You're right. They are kind of bluesy. I think they have a little bit of a Southern feel. They're Florida sort of time, mixed in with the glam metal and the stuff that they do. But you know, they did have a lot of problems. I did see them once at Fat Jack's in Council Bluffs, Iowa, the Rock City Angels. I tried to look up the exact date and I couldn't find it. There was no reference to it. So I don't know if it's like it was 1989, I imagine, is when it happened. But that's when I got to see them at that show. The only thing I'll say about the band is like they had this album in '88. It didn't exactly do that well. People that remember them fondly, but not enough people remember them. They started working on a second album for Geffen, and after 2 years of working on it, Geffen had rejected 80 songs. 80.
Wow.
Said, no, we're not doing any of this. And eventually just dropped them, and that was that. And they broke up, and most of that stuff didn't come out until many years later. They reformed in maybe 2007 or something. But basically, they did get screwed. But maybe it was, I mean, I don't know. I don't know how you reject 80 different songs. Like not one of them was good enough. I'm not really sure about that.
That's crazy. I've never heard of that many songs getting rejected. And my question is, why were they rejected? Were they just horrible, horrible songs?
That is one big pile of shit.
The best songs on there, though, are Deep Inside My Heart, a tune called Mary, another one called Our Little Secret, Boy from Hell's Kitchen, and then they do a cover of Otis Redding to show how different they are, of These Arms of Mine by Otis Redding. Like a hair metal band doesn't usually cover Otis Redding. So I felt like they were a little bit different in that regard too, because that didn't seem abnormal, you know?
Wow.
And they did record the record in Memphis. So if you're looking for a little bit more raw band than your average hair metal band, they did get lumped in with Guns N' Roses. They don't really sound like Guns N' Roses, but they do have a more raw feel. Their songs are very passionate. They had a great singer. Bobby Durango, the lead singer, died in 2012. So they're not doing anything anymore these days. But the album is on YouTube. So if you look on YouTube for Rock City Angels, Young Man's Blues, the album, the original version, you can find it on there, but that's it. Streamers doesn't exist.
It's too bad it never went anywhere. And the guys, I'm surprised the guys were like right in my wheelhouse. Like I'm surprised I didn't like gravitate toward this band and learn more about them, because some of them were hot. And I always paid attention to the bands that had the hot guys.
The record holds up. I actually listened to it today on YouTube, and to the first album. It's a double album, and it sounded great. So it still holds up in my opinion. So there you go. My number one was the Rock City Angels.
My second selection is another one of those bands that I really only remember the one album from them, but it was a good one. This is a band called Bonham. And sometimes when I look up this band, I see it referred to as the Jason Bonham Band, but I'm 100% positive that when they came out, this band was known as Bonham. And
no, you're right. They're separate. Not to interrupt, but Bonham was a thing that had two albums in the late 80s, early 90s. Then they broke up. Then later on, he made the Jason Bonham Band. So they are two separate things completely.
Sometimes when you Google it, you can only really find a mishmash of the two of them, and it's referred to as Jason Bonham Band. But that's not what I'm talking about here. I'm talking about Bonham. They had a great album called The Disregard for Timekeeping, I believe was the name of it. And it did, of course, feature Jason Bonham, who is the son of Led Zeppelin founder John Bonham, the very famous drummer. John passed away when Jason was, I think, 14 years old. So obviously the influence was there. And he formed all kinds of bands. Like if you look through Jason Bonham's history and career, he's collaborated with pretty much everyone. But I loved this little sliver of time where he had this band Bonham. One of the reasons is because this lead singer, Daniel McMaster, was so hot. I remember watching them on Headbangers Ball and just like being mesmerized. He was sort of like a mishmash between Joey Tempest from the band Europe and then like maybe Leif Garrett from the 70s, but like hot Leif Garrett, not like drunk Leif Garrett from like the 90s and 2000s. He's a super, super, super hot guy. However, the very sad part about all of that is Daniel McMaster actually passed away when he was only 39 years old. He had strep infection that turned into sepsis and he actually died. So very sad. However, please go watch Wait For You. Wait For You was my all-time favorite cut from this particular album. And then they had another one that made the MTV circuit called Guilty. These were really great performances. I loved just the sound. Guilty actually features a little bit of rock violin, which is very reminiscent of some of the things that Jimmy Page would do with Led Zeppelin. But it's a super cool sounding band. Again, I know I had the full cassette of this one. I didn't have just the cassette single, like I mentioned with Electric Boys, full cassette. And it's a great one.
No, I remember Bonham. I remember them from when they came out because he's attached to Led Zeppelin and he had just been playing with Jimmy Page just prior.
Yeah.
And in fact, I think right before that, Led Zeppelin did a one-off reunion show for some anniversary for the record company and he filled in. But I remember Bonham, and I remember at that time, like 89, 88, 89, there were a lot of bands, like every couple of years that sort of the Zeppelin sound comes back into vogue. Mm-hmm. And that was a period where a lot of them were, and Kingdom Come was one of those bands.
Yes,
and a couple others where they had
Kingdom Come almost made my list, by the way. But
did you really?
Yes, Kingdom Come very much had that Led Zeppelin sound.
Right. And there was a lot of that going on. And I felt like, okay, like a Zeppelin influence makes sense, but Jason Bonham has more right to have a band that sounds like Led Zeppelin than the rest of these guys. Like, so more so.
Yes, and you know what's interesting about that too is that a lot of those bands that sounded like Led Zeppelin at the time actually got blasted for it. Like people weren't fans of that. Like now I think if a band sounds like Led Zeppelin, people are like, oh my God, that's such a throwback. That's so cool. But in the late 80s, people weren't on board with it. They didn't think that was cool. They didn't think that was awesome. However, I think there's a difference, like you said, with Jason Bonham's band, because of course they sounded like Led Zeppelin. And of course that made sense. And people were much more accepting of it. Kingdom Come was an example of a band that sounded like Led Zeppelin. But if you read through a lot of the old critique of that album or of fans' comments or non-fans' comments, they really didn't like the fact that they sounded like Led Zeppelin.
They called them Kingdom Clone. My number 2 is a band called Lillian Axe. Mm-hmm. Might remember them. Probably
I do vaguely.
Probably not. We discussed them a little bit because I sent you a clip from Fat Jacks, and one of the guys and some of the members were in this band. We have a running theme with this Fat Jacks because that was the heavy metal club in Council Bluffs, Iowa, kind of Omaha in the late 80s. And most of these bands would come through. That was our only heavy metal club really in the area. Lillian Axe formed in New Orleans in 1983. They were discovered when they opened for Rat in, I think, 1987. Their manager, Milton Berle, Marshall Berle, nephew of Milton Berle, who was Rat's manager and had briefly been Van Halen's manager, was managing them, got them a deal with MCA Records. But at that same time, 3 of the band members were fired. And so he was looking for new members. At one point, Janie Lane of Warrant, who even though he was in Warrant and they were negotiating their contract with Columbia Records, flew down to New Orleans to sort of audition to be the singer for Lillian Axe. And this has been confirmed by the band. What happened was he came down for a couple of days. They got along okay. I don't know how this sort of transpired. But basically, Janie Lane was a songwriter, and so was the other guy, the guitar player in this band, Stevie Blaze. And neither one of them wanted to sort of give up and be like, okay, I'll just take the back seat. You can be the main songwriter. So they sent Janie Lane back to LA, and he went on to be much more successful with Warrant. Their first album was produced by Robin Crosby of Rat. It's a great record. I thought it sounded like Rat, just with a better singer, a technically better singer. I'm not knocking Stephen Pearcy. I love the guy, but he has a better voice. I was drawn to these guys because by 1988, I was starting to phase out a little bit from this music, as we've discussed in the past. But I still liked more aggressive stuff, and it wasn't like a light switch and it just turned off and I stopped listening to it. Lillian Axe came around and there was the tie into Rat, and I loved Rat. And also their lyrics just seemed different. Like, they didn't seem so overtly stupid. And when they had songs like Misery Loves Company and Laughing in Your Face and stuff like that, or even the song called She Likes It on Top, which sounds like it's going to be super sexual, right? But it's not. It's about she likes being on top of the world. Like, it was a different, so they wrote about different shit, and I just felt like that's why I was sort of interested in them. Their second album was produced by a guy named Tony Platt, who had worked with AC/DC and Cheap Trick and Foreigner. It went nowhere. None of the records did anything. They got dropped by MCA. They signed on to IRS. They did a couple more records that actually did better. They're still together now. They broke up in the mid 90s. They got back together a couple years later. There is a version of the band that exists today, but only one member from that late 80s version of the band is still there. You know, MCA was a terrible label. They just were. They did a terrible job with almost everyone. They were good at R&B and rap, and in the 80s they just didn't have a good rock roster except for Tom Petty, and that was it. And they just didn't do a good job. And I mean, how do you have it that you have Rat's manager, a guy from Rat produced your album, and yet you don't go out on tour opening for Rat? Like, they got no touring opportunities with anyone. They were the opening act for nobody. They had to go to the clubs and just hit clubs.
I do think that's interesting, though, about the touring aspect, because I think that's why I didn't really know anything about them, because they were never out. You know, and we had, growing up in Sioux City, like in the Sioux City, Iowa area, we really had no club scene to speak of at all. We didn't have a Fat Jack's or anything even close to that. And so
you missed out. You missed out on Fat Jack.
What's that?
You missed out on Fat Jack.
I know. I didn't even know about this place. But if a band was not on a major tour, like, I would have never seen this band. Never. And the only way I would have seen them, obviously, is if they would have had any play on like a Headbangers Ball or on MTV at some point. But I really don't remember this band at all. I remembered a little bit the tie-in to Robin Crosby and Rat, but really nothing else about them. And if you look at like some of their stuff, they look very hard now. Like, they look very like heavy metal, hard rock kind of dudes, not so much like the poppy kind of metal that we were used to in the 80s.
The label chose the wrong songs a lot of times. Like, they had their second album, Love and War, from 1989, which was an impeccably produced album. I thought it could have done really, really well. Again, MCA didn't do shit with it, but they chose the song called Show a Little Love as the single. That song is terrible. I'm sorry. It's just not good. They had much better songs like Down on You or She Likes It on Top or Diana or whatever, like, that were much, much better. And I just don't understand like why they chose that particular song as a single. It was corny. It was not good. And the video was kind of weak. And it's like, you have this band that has all this talent, and they just seem to not know how to work with them. I did say they left MCA. They went to IRS. They had a couple of records past the hair metal era. So in 92 and like 94, that actually did better. I mean, they did a cover of, what was it? Oh, No Matter What by Badfinger. Great tune. Not all of it holds up, but I was giving them a listen again to get anticipation for the video. I still thought that first record that Robin Crosby did was very solid. And the song Laughing in Your Face holds up all these years later.
I think that's the true test. It's like, when you listen to that song just in isolation now, does it feel like it's something that could be played on the radio currently? And to me, that's the test anyway. That, you know, that's what I just said about All Lips and Hips. I feel like that's a song that I could hear right now that would still hold up.
It wasn't the same, you know, the same BS that was starting to happen with so many bands at that point, where every song was just some like sexist nonsense of just over and over and over. And you're just like, okay, dude, I mean, like, I get it. I like girls too, but I mean, there's more to life than just, you know, scoping out. I mean, you know, it just is like, you get tired of it sometimes. And these guys were offering something slightly different. I think that's why I was attracted to them.
My third pick is actually a band that did have a level of success. They just never had the level of success that I think they should have, and that band is KISS. These guys had some great songs, yet they really never made it past the opener status. But they had Cold Blood, Blow My Fuse, Get It While It's Hot, Don't Close Your Eyes. The list kind of goes on and on. They have great energy in their videos, great stage presence. Steve Whiteman, the lead singer, has a phenomenal voice. Brian Forsyth and Ronnie Youngkins were the two kind of guitar duo featured guitarists in that band, and they're on my list of like my all-time favorite guitarists. I think they're phenomenal. I don't think I ever saw KISS live, which is something I'm totally devastated by. But I truthfully don't think they ever opened for any band that I saw in the 80s or early 90s. They did play Sioux Falls in February of 1989 with Rat and Brittany Fox, but I don't think I saw that show. So I'm really sad about that. Their final show was in September of 2023, and I'm told by their agent that they for sure will not go back out. Steve Whiteman has had enough of the touring life. He's enjoying retirement, but the band formed in 1978. So they put in their time. Like they were out there for a while. Couple of interesting things. Apparently, there was kind of this feud going on between KISS and Poison. The rumor was that Bret Michaels stole Steve Whiteman's stage persona, and then KISS actually opened for Poison at the Country Club out in Los Angeles at some point, and had it like handed right to them that Bret Michaels had taken a lot of what Steve White's persona was on stage and kind of, used it for his own purposes. Now, I see some of it. I see some of the similarities when I watch the stage shows and when I watch the two of them perform. A lot of KISS's music videos had a lot of live stage performances included. And I see a little bit of the crossover with Bret and with Steve. Not a ton, but apparently according to KISS, they were really pissed about that. And then also there were issues with Atlantic Records, which is where KISS was signed. According to reports, the band made no money whatsoever off of their biggest album, Blow My Fuse. And this sadly was common for a lot of these bands back then, whether it was poor money management, poor management in general, bad contracts with the labels. They really didn't see any sort of financial benefit from what ended up to be their biggest album. So that's a little bit of a sad turn in the career of KISS, but they did go on to play live for many, many, many years. Like I said, their last show being in September of 2023.
Yeah, no, that happened to a lot of bands. And what I think it is these labels had like a fixed thing. It's like, okay, we get our name producer. That producer is going to get a couple points off the top. Those points come from the artist, not from the label. So they're automatically, the producer is making more money than the artist straight off the bat. Then you have all of the promotional costs. So you have a video that costs $100,000 to make, whether it gets played or not. You have the record where the budgets used to be $300,000-$400,000. So now you're clicking up to almost $1 million of spent money before the band even hits the road. Then you have tour support. These bands can't play clubs and ride around in a tour bus and not have to be borrowing that money, right? They don't make enough money at the show. They don't generate the revenue to even afford the bus. So that's how these bands get millions of dollars in debt. I liked KISS. I thought they were a cool band. They had a big AC/DC kind of influence, like an American AC/DC a little bit. And yeah, they did seem to get the shaft a little bit from the industry. And they did have that hit, Don't Close Your Eyes, but like it was a moderate hit. And I feel that whatever money could have been generated from that probably barely touched the debt that they already had from all their previous records. So
yes.
Not a surprise that they're broke. I mean, it sucks. It's not like the label can go after you personally on that. It's not like they're going to be going after the singer of KISS and saying, we want that $1 million back, but you're just never going to see anything from your work until it's paid off. And that's the main thing, but it happens to a lot of bands, unfortunately.
Yes, very, very sad. But I do love that band. I think their sound was a little bit different from some of what was going on out there. It was a little bit more on that kind of raw side that we've talked about before that some of these bands had, not so polished as a Poison, for example, or a Bon Jovi, but definitely a great band. And I'm just so devastated that I'll never get to see them live because they're not touring anymore.
They are done. They are done.
Mm-hmm.
My third and final choice for my underappreciated hair metal band is Black and Blue.
Nice.
Now, Black and Blue, I've got a couple of records here. I've Black and Blue, Black and Blue, Black and Blue. I did love these guys. Now, some people are going to say, oh, Dave, you're only picking them because you're a KISS fan and Tommy Thayer was in KISS from 2002 to the end. No. In fact, that's actually what would almost prevented me from choosing Black and Blue.
Oh, interesting.
I am not happy that Tommy Thayer was in KISS pretending to be Ace Frehley. I'm on record as saying I think all that stuff sucks, that you shouldn't put other people in those guys' makeup. Doesn't matter who owns it. I get it. KISS owned the makeup. They could put other guys in there. I didn't like it. I'm moving on from that. We're not talking about that. We're talking about Black and Blue. Black and Blue was formed by Tommy Thayer and Jamie St. James in 1981 in Portland, Oregon. They moved to LA the next year. In 82, they were signed to Geffen and had their debut album out by 1984. So they were kind of a little bit early on the glam metal thing. They were peers of like Rat and Motley Crue from that sort of time. Their first ever demo, which is a song called Chains Around Heaven, wound up on a thing called the Metal Massacre compilation. This Metal Massacre is known for featuring the first ever recordings of Metallica and Rat on this compilation. Black and Blue was on there as well. So their first album had their best song, Hold On to 18. It was produced by Dieter Dierks, who's known for working with the Scorpions. But it's their second album that's really the focus. They did an album called Without Love. They did it with the producer Bruce Fairbairn in Vancouver, Canada. If you're a Bon Jovi fan, you know that's where Slippery When Wet was made, in Vancouver with Bruce Fairbairn at that studio. And John Bon Jovi is on record saying that the reason why they chose Bruce Fairbairn was because they heard Black and Blue's Without Love and thought it was the best sounding album they had heard in years, and were like, we want this. So if you're a fan of Slippery When Wet, the reason why it's so successful, part of the reason, is because they were inspired by Black and Blue to like check out, go with this producer, go with this studio, go with this whatever. And that changed the course of their life. Didn't really help Black and Blue much. Their album didn't sell very well. Their next two albums were produced by Gene Simmons. And those records weren't quite as good, but that did get my interest, of course, with the Gene Simmons thing. And he formed a lasting friendship with Gene and Paul Stanley. And when these guys broke up in 1989, he went to work as like Gene Simmons' assistant, and then worked his way up to tour manager, and then worked his way up to eventually being a member of the band. He was the guitar player by 2002. Interesting. So they were very poppy. They were very radio friendly. They looked good in the videos. You know, it's just like, it's a mystery why they didn't make it. Their singer, Jamie St. James, later went on to sing for Warrant for a couple of years in the 2000s. He replaced Janie Lane for a bit. Then Janie Lane came back. And that was the end of his turn with that. Black and Blue does exist now, but I don't know who's in the band. I think it's most of the people other than Tommy Thayer. There is a compilation on Universal that Universal put out years ago called The Ultimate Collection, Black and Blue. And that has songs from the first four records, all their classic stuff. Most of their best known songs are on there. And those would be like Hold On to 18, Rockin' on Heaven's Door, Stop the Lightning, Auto Blast, 12 O'Clock High, stuff like that. Those are their best known songs. So yeah, just a missed opportunity. I don't know. They had great touring opportunities because they opened for Aerosmith. They opened for KISS. They opened for all these other bands, and yet it didn't work for them. So in their case, they had the touring. They had the big producer. They had a name, Gene Simmons, doing a couple of records for them. They had all of that stuff. Oh, by the way, on the one album that Gene Simmons produced, their power ballad was a song called I'll Be There For You. And that was produced by Jonathan Cain of Journey. So they had everything lined up, and yet it just didn't happen. It's a mystery.
That's so interesting. And by the way, I don't remember this band really at all. I remember the name kind of, but I don't have any recollection whatsoever of what their sound was, their songs, any album releases, nothing. Like Jamie St. James, I think I really only know his name because of the time that he spent with Warren, as you mentioned, in the early 2000s.
Oh, yeah.
So this was another one of those bands that like totally went over my head and I missed almost completely.
And I think you'll see after listening to it, you'll be like, how could this band have not made, like, they just seem like they should have made it. You know, they obviously had a lot of talent, and they're another band that made nothing from their entire career. I mean, zero. Yeah, Tommy Thayer went on to work for KISS and then work his way up to being a band member. But yeah, I did not choose Black and Blue because of Tommy Thayer's involvement with KISS. I chose Black and Blue in spite of Tommy Thayer's involvement with KISS, because I don't really blame him for the whole wearing the other guy's makeup. I blame Gene Simmons and Paul Stanley for that, because it was their decision. If I were offered a gig to like play in KISS, I suppose I'd maybe take it as well. Like if I was offered a bunch of money to join KISS, like maybe I would, but it rubbed me the wrong way. And I still 20 plus years later after it happened, I'm still pissed about it. It still bothers me. I don't get it.
He was playing a role. But I love talking about these bands that were sort of like very much secondary and tertiary bands, because a lot of them had some really great music. And for me, like I still listen to a lot of this stuff pretty regularly. And so I love to be able to talk about it and bring it back into public consciousness a little bit. But
well, it got me a chance to, yeah. I mean, look, you know a lot about this kind of music, and I stumped you with two of the bands.
I know.
You stumped me with one of them. And so there's still a lot of room to be, you know, I follow some groups on Facebook, and they show albums of bands. I've never heard of them. And I'm just like, wow, I thought I was Johnny on the spot on all that stuff, but it's just not possible to have known everything. And so I see this as a topic we might be revisiting.
Well, there was a lot of it. And I think that's the thing to remember is at this time in history, like this was the popular music. And so the labels were just pushing out like band after band after band. And so there was a lot of it, to your point. There are probably many more bands that we could have talked about. I had to kind of whittle my list down to 3 because I had a bunch of other bands that I could have mentioned. So we'll have to do this episode another time.
I like all of them, and revisiting them was not cringy. I was worried that even though I love them,
that's the criteria,
right?
Revisiting them was not cringy.
So yeah, this will pretty much conclude our episode 3. Subscribe to the channel, like the video, and if you want any topics or bands that you think we would like to discuss, leave them in the comments. We will see you out there. There's a bunch of shows coming up, and we'll see you out there at the venues.
Sounds great. See you next time.
Absolutely.
So, you have a MySpace page or something?